Okay, so as I was saying, the foreign conflicts, especially the French and Indian War, um, do a lot to unify the colonies as well. So you have this exposure to combat experience, which is the most important part of it. But crucially, the British don't integrate the American colonists into their own military units. Instead, they keep them separate. So, for example, you'll have the Massachusetts militia fighting, as a distinct unit, and they won't be integrated into the Redcoats. And so this helps to actually unify the colonial fighters with each other rather than with the British Empire. And it's a very big mistake for the British. During the war, too, in 1754, the colonial delegates get together in Albany and come up with something we call the Albany Plan. It was presented to a Congress of representatives from the different colonies, 7 of them only, who meet in Albany to talk about plans to unify for defense, for a common defense against the French, as well as to unify to deal with the Indian nations on better terms. The plan was not talking about independence from Great Britain at this point, not anything like that at all, but rather simply a unified colonial government with a president appointed by the king and a council that would consist of representatives from each colony. So it would be a way of having some colonial government separate from the government in London so they could respond to conditions in North America more quickly than going back and forth, to London with communications. The Congress meeting in Albany approved the plan, but once it was taken back to the colonial assemblies, they rejected it out of hand. Benjamin Franklin was the key proponent of the plan, along with Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island, but both men were unable to convince their home states, Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, to go along with it. The elected colonial assemblies they didn't want to give up any power to this kind of institution, so they didn't go for it. The war is a war for empire, as all the wars in the colonial period are, and the British are fighting the French, and once the French are defeated, and Great Britain controls all the territory in North America that France had controlled, there's less of a reason, from the colonial point of view, there's less of a reason for the British to still have control over the colonies in the Americas. They don't need to provide the same level of defense as they used to when the French were a real threat. And so the colonials kind of want the British to go away. And so that's the other lasting impact of the French and Indian War. The political situation, as I said, is such that in the colonies, almost all the colonies have elected colonial assemblies. And governors don't have a lot of power. They don't have the power to tax, usually, and so they have to rely on the elected assemblies to raise money and provide the funds for whatever the governors want to do. So even though the governors are appointed by the king and not elected, it's the colonial assemblies that have the most power. So you have this fairly democratic system then, where at least people with property, men with property mostly, can vote for the colonial assemblies, and that's where the real power lies. They still can't vote for a member of parliament in London, of course, and that is an issue that really bothers them. But most of what they're dealing with on a day-to-day level happens at the colonial level anyway. So I mentioned the religious background too, and how the Great Awakening helps to unify the colonies. One other thing that I want to mention is the Enlightenment, which is kind of the counterpoint to the Great Awakening. The Enlightenment is this kind of stress on rational thought that becomes very popular in Europe and to a somewhat lesser extent in North America in the 18th century. Rational thought in order to solve broader social issues. It's very hopeful. It's an idea of human progress, an idea that humans have the ability to think through problems rationally and come up with solutions. This is in contrast to sort of the pre-modern way of thinking, which assumed that human beings didn't have much capabilities and instead had to rely on supernatural or religious, rely on God to solve their problems. The Enlightenment suggests that human beings can solve their own problems. John Locke is an early Enlightenment philosopher, and your textbook talks about him at some length. He's very important to the American Revolution, of course, and much of the Declaration of Independence comes from John Locke's writings of 100 years before. And John Locke justifies the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688 by saying that if any government tries to take away the liberty of the people, then the people have the right to revolt. He also argues in favor of religious toleration, and basically accepts the status quo as it is. He's important both because of his radical thinking, but also because of his conservative side, that he says that all rights come from the Creator. And the Creator is a rather vague way of talking about God that doesn't really identify God as specifically one faith, one religion or another. But he does use that term, and of course Jefferson will use that term in the Declaration of Independence as well. The French Enlightenment thinkers are much more radical and tend to be atheistic and leave God out of it entirely because they don't tend to believe in God. And John Locke, in his more conservative, maybe is the wrong word, but his more moderate approach to religion, his more moderate approach to political change, is more what the American revolutionary leaders will embrace. But anyway, you should, if you haven't looked at this in the textbook carefully enough, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but the Enlightenment, of course, is central to understanding the American Revolution. And I will talk about the Enlightenment revolutions elsewhere more tomorrow. You have a tradition of English dissent in politics too, and these men are arguing not only in America but even more so in Great Britain that liberty is very much part of the English political tradition, and there are certain rights that are basic to being English. And there's this sense that in the 18th century, throughout the British Empire, rights are in danger, that there are people in government, in Parliament, and with the King and his ministers who are interested in taking away some of the rights that English people have come to expect. And the American colonists will correspond with these dissenters in England, and they'll use some of their ideas as well. And so again, in many ways, this is not just an American Revolution that we're talking about, but this transatlantic world. This is throughout the British Empire. There are people talking about these same things. But in America, there's a solution that becomes apparent, which is to break with the mother country entirely, whereas in England, the solution is more about protecting liberties that are already in existence. You have local institutions established in the 18th century and before that allow people to think of these colonies now as their homes. Harvard, of course, has been around now since the 1630s, and so by the 18th century you have a number of other institutions that have followed in Harvard's footsteps. People are now sending their young adult children to these local schools to be educated rather than sending them back to England for training. You have libraries and churches, of course, other institutions at the local level, political institutions we've already talked about. And so all these institutions now that are established allow people to think of these places as their homes rather than some colonial outpost that's far from home home being England. Plus, we're talking now about, in some cases, the fourth or fifth or sixth generation of colonists, people who have no memory, no experience with England itself. After the French and Indian War ends, then, in early 1760s, Britain fights another war right away against the Indians. This is the Pontiac's Rebellion that your textbook has quite a bit of detail on and is interesting to read about, and so make sure you've read that part. One response from the British after the war with the Indians is to impose a line along the Allegheny Mountains, saying that the colonists cannot move past this line. If you don't know where the Allegheny Mountains are, make sure you look at the map in the textbook that shows you where the line is. It's important to understand what kind of territory we're talking about. The British asked the colonists now to pay for higher taxes in order to pay for the defense of that new perimeter, that new defensive line, protection money, essentially. And the colonists respond by saying, what are you talking about? Protection from who? We don't feel the need to have this line here. The colonists, of course, want to keep pushing west. They want that land. They want to open it up for settlement. It's cheap, to provide people with land in the West. That's one of the big draws, of course, for people coming to America in the first place, is that they can own their own land, unlike in Europe, where land is hard to come by. The colonists, thought that after the French and Indian War, what they would see is lower taxes. They thought they would see equal footing with Great Britain at home. They would hope that they would see new lands that they could settle in the wake of the war. And instead, the opposite of all those things happens. Great Britain cracks down and imposes its authority more strongly. Great Britain raises taxes in order to pay for the defense of all this new territory that they've taken from the French and from the Indians. And they have closed off the frontier with the proclamation of 1763, drawing that line that says the colonists can't move further west. And so this is all very upsetting to the colonists, and by the mid-1760s, as new acts are being passed by Parliament to raise taxes even further, the colonists begin to revolt. I wanted to mention Stephen Hopkins a little bit more than what your textbook does, because he's a Rhode Islander and because he is very important to this period anyway. Hopkins starts out in politics in the 1730s, and he was Rhode Island's delegate, as I said before, to the Albany Congress in 1754, and was one of the earliest advocates for independence from Great Britain in the 1760s. In 1764, he issued a pamphlet that was printed by Sarah and Mary Goddard, two women, a daughter and a mother, who operated a printing press and a newspaper in Providence, and which is an interesting fact in and of itself. But they were able to distribute this pamphlet throughout the colonies, and it becomes one of the most famous documents of the pre-revolutionary period. Hopkins' rights of the colonies examined argued that England was simply too far away, and Parliament could not legislate for the colonies appropriately or fairly because it was too far away, and only a united assembly in the colonies would be able to figure out what's best for the people who live there. Hopkins will go on to be a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He'll serve as the Continental Congress's the chair of the Naval Committee to establish the first United States Navy during the war. He was in charge of procuring vessels for the Navy and drafting captains and sailors for the ships. And his expertise as a very successful shipping merchant based in Providence is what prepared him to do this. John Adams, the second president of the United States and a key revolutionary leader himself, later wrote in his autobiography that, quote, "Governor Hopkins of Rhode Island, above 70 years of age, kept us all alive. Upon business, his experience and judgment were very useful. But when the business of the evening was over, he kept us in conversation till 11 and sometimes 12 o'clock. His custom was to drink nothing all day, nor till 8 o'clock in the evening, and then his beverage was Jamaica spirit and water." that is, rum and water. It gave him wit, humor, anecdotes, science, and learning. He had read Greek, Roman, and British history. He was familiar with English poetry, particularly Pope, Thomson, and Milton. And the flow of his soul made all his reading our own, and seemed to bring to recollection in all of us all we had ever read. I could neither eat nor drink in those days. The other gentlemen were very temperate. Hopkins never drank to excess, but all he drank was immediately not only converted into wit, sense, knowledge, and good humor, but inspired us all with similar qualities. Hopkins had palsy and was noted to have said as he signed the Declaration of Independence, "My hand trembles, my heart does not." And so Hopkins is one of those figures that we don't usually hear too much about, but is really important. The Stamp Act was issued in 1765, and this was the act that everybody disliked in the colonies because it essentially taxed documents and newspapers. Any printed paper had to have a stamp on it now, had to be approved. So it was a way of censoring as well as taxing. And lawyers didn't like it because it meant all the documents they dealt with had to get this royal stamp on it. Newspaper writers, those who were most political, really, in spreading ideas in this period, didn't like it. So the most influential people, really, in the colonies were the ones who were most against the Stamp Act. You had a number of protests, Stamp Act protests, the formation of groups like the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty in New England, who then spread elsewhere. These early groups that start to protest against what the British are doing. This is when we see the rise of larger opposition movements. There's a non-importation movement, and as your textbook talks about at some length, this was a movement that was led largely by women, and women were really important in the non-importation movement. They enforced it. They made sure that people weren't buying British goods. A lot of merchants who said they were in favor of it were secretly importing British goods, and these women would go around and make sure that everybody was living up to the deal and refusing to buy or sell British goods. The Stamp Act protest brings new leaders to the fore. Hopkins, John Adams, Sam Adams, John Dickinson in Pennsylvania, who writes as a Pennsylvania farmer in a number of pamphlets. And one of the things that this does is that it shows, again, the colonists that they have shared interests. Whether they're in Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, they have an interest in defeating the Stamp Act. We also see some violence, and some of the Stamp Act, some of the people who actually issue the stamps in the various cities are attacked violently by mobs, and this is an unfortunate side effect, of course, of the Revolutionary period. But this does get people mobilized. You have the Boston Massacre then in 1770, which is, as your textbook talks about too, traditionally in American history, the sense was that this was a terrible event where the British opened fire on a defenseless crowd and killed 5 colonists who were peacefully there in Boston. We know better. We know now that first you had a mob and a lot of kids who were throwing rocks and snowballs at some British soldiers who were off duty, and eventually it escalates and somebody fires a shot, and then the British soldiers kind of panic and fire into the crowd, and they do kill 5 working class Bostonians, men who had some altercations with British soldiers in the past. The British soldiers themselves are working class people, and they had to supplement their meager incomes, their meager salaries, by finding odd jobs throughout Boston. And this put them in conflict with put them in conflict with working class Bostonians because they were competing for a lot of the same jobs. And so these were men who were fighting in the streets, fist fights frequently in 1770. And the so-called Boston Massacre was really just a street fight that got out of hand and led to the killing of these 5 men. But the emerging colonial leaders kind of seized this as an opportunity and Paul Revere in Boston makes an engraving of the Boston Massacre that becomes famous as it's printed elsewhere, and just shows this massacre, shows the British soldiers firing on an unarmed, peaceful crowd, and this becomes what most colonists think really happened. And so this is an early incident that sort of galvanizes public opinion against the British soldiers. 1772, of course, we have the Gaspee incident in Rhode Island, which I've learned from past experience. To my surprise, many of you won't have heard about before. But this is the first real violent uprising by the colonists in the colonies against the British. And what happened with the Gaspee incident is you have the British patrolling Narragansett Bay, trying to prevent Providence merchants from going past Newport illegally and not stopping at Newport to pay the customs duties on the stuff they've imported on their ships. And instead they try to sneak by on the other side of Jamestown up through the bay to Providence and unload their stuff before the British find out that they've returned from their voyage. The Gaspee was a British ship that was charged with patrolling the bay and was looking for Providence merchants who were trying to avoid paying their taxes. The Providence-based ship that the Gaspee was chasing sailed up and got close to Providence off of Warwick Cove and managed to get the British ship, the Gaspee, to run into a sandbar, to run aground in shallow water, and then take off and go back to Providence. And when they arrived in Providence, the locals went around and told John Brown, one of the leading shippers in Providence, what had happened. And John Brown goes over to Sabin's Tavern in Providence and tells the people drinking there that there's this British ship that's now run aground and stuck, and this is an opportunity to go out and sink this British ship, which would be a pretty aggressive and violent act at this point. They get enough people to go out, and they row out, and they board the British ship in the darkness. One of the younger people on this secret mission shoots the captain of the ship, the commander of the ship, and wounds him seriously, but doesn't kill him, and in the end he's okay. But they do seize the ship, they take the British crew off the ship, they burn the ship down to the waterline, and that's the Gaspee incident. Now, the aftermath is what's really interesting, because the British authorities, of course, want to go after the people who did this, and they ask the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, essentially, in Rhode Island, who happens to be, at this point, Stephen Hopkins, to start getting affidavits from witnesses. And Stephen Hopkins, of course, his sympathies lie with John Brown, his friend, and the other raiders. And so Hopkins, replies that there are no witnesses, that nobody's come forward. And in fact, in the end, nobody does come forward, and Hopkins and others are able to avoid any further prosecutions. The British are outraged, of course, by this, and this, creates a new atmosphere of distrust between British authorities and their colonial subjects. One of the things the British will do in response is to demand that American colonists charged with serious crimes will now be brought back to Britain for trial, because they don't trust the colonial authorities now, in the wake of what Hopkins does, to handle the cases themselves. The Gaspee incident also is what leads to the Committee of Correspondence being formed, where this group of leaders in the various colonies in Virginia, in Rhode Island, in Massachusetts in particular, start to correspond with each other to keep each other apprised of the different situations in their colonies and make sure they're responding appropriately. And then finally, of course, you have the Boston Tea Party the following year, in December of 1773, where in response to the Tea Act, which essentially gives the British East India Company a monopoly on tea, and initially lower prices on tea for the colonists, but with the lower prices, they know that this is sort of a trick to get them to all buy British East India Tea Company tea, and then eventually the East India Tea Company can raise its prices because they'll have a monopoly on all the tea sold in the colonies. And so the colonists strike first by seizing a vessel and dumping 10,000 pounds of tea or something ridiculous, maybe more, into Boston Harbor. And everybody knows about the Tea Party. If you don't, then of course it's in your textbook, as you know. So these successive protests kind of build from the non-importation movement and the protest against the Stamp Act, sometimes violent protest against the Stamp Act, the Gaspee incident, the Tea Party, and you can see where we're heading here as the violence starts to pick up in the early 1770s. So I'll leave off at this point. You have another video to watch. That's the Crash Course History video on the American Revolution, which is hopefully a more fun, it's a little silly, but a more fun way of looking at the American Revolution than me sitting in front of this camera.